Oh, we were just informed that you need a premium account to go live on Twitter, which we do not have. So we're live, but not as live as we thought. So let's do the intro. Welcome back to the Ergonomic Sausage Factory, where we grind it into whatever it's going to be. You don't need to see how it's made. Sasha, today we're going to talk about some things and some stuff. But first, I want to tell a little joke, and it's a joke that it's my mathematics background. So there's a professor, and he's giving a lecture, and he's doing this proof on the board, and he claims that this is obvious, that this he writes down his things, and he's like, this is obvious. And one of the students raised their hand and said, is this obvious? Are we sure that's obvious? And the math teacher proceeds to fill up, depending on your version of the joke, 2 chalkboards, back when people used chalk, we'll say whiteboards, of writing, and then at the end, therefore this is obvious, but it only took 2 chalkboards to prove it's obvious. So one of my favorite things about Sasha is she makes me explain things that I think are obvious. That may not be as obvious to other people. So that's part of what our exercise is today. And before we get into what I think is interesting and obvious is the problem that I think this solves, or one thing I have a reaction to, is when you're having conversations in an organization or working in an organization, and people start making observations or assertions that other people are stupid or that other people are ill-intentioned, right? So you see this in the DevOps conversation. It's like, oh, that side's stupid, and like our side's smart, or that side has bad intentions, and and you can see this at every level and across almost every capability in an organization. So you have this sort of disconnect between sales and marketing. You have this disconnect between marketing and product. You have this disconnect between whatever the roles are. And what I think is obvious, or what I'm trying to get people to think about, is if you actually look at the local frame, the rational behavior that you'd expect from people in a particular role, given the incentives that they have, they're actually super rational, they're super smart, and they're doing the best thing they can with the rules of the game they were given. So that's part of what I think sets up, or what my intentions were with some of the stuff we want to talk about today.
Here, I'm gonna. Hi, Dr. J. Bloom. How you doing?
You made it.
I studied time. I'm just not very good at it.
That's probably partially why you studied time, right?
Absolutely.
I'm sure you're playing locally rational games, but it's fine.
Exactly. Yeah.
Someone had this joke, like, all research is research.
It's true.
Nice.
It's true.
Yeah.
So what are we gonna say?
No, it's a interesting point to what you're saying, and like this happens so much, right? Like when people kind of get tribal and assume that someone else is ill-intentioned. I don't hear like calling people like foolish or stupid too much, but I hear like the ill-intention, or like, they just don't understand, or like stuff like that. And then the other thing that's really funny is like everyone is always assuming that their function is crucial for the business, whereas other things are not necessarily. And I don't know, it feels like, since I reported into multiple departments throughout my career, it always feels so funny when people are like, oh yeah, that like, everything else doesn't matter. Like, we here write code, or we here market, or we here sell, and this is the only thing that drives the business.
So we had a lot of conversations before where Jabe or I started talking about this notion of delamination and disintegration. And I think one, we like to hear ourselves talk, but two, there's moments where you're like, oh, I get it. Like we were talking about it before, and you're like nodding and like, okay, yeah, whatever, Andrew. But then there's like this moments where you're like, okay, I understand it. It's like you get excited about it, or as excited about it as we are. So maybe for the sake of the audience, like you set up what you think we're talking about when we talk about delamination and disintegration in an organization.
So I think that like the visual is like helpful. Let's see if I can actually have a visual on here. Like I actually think that it's like difficult to think about these things without sort of having a visual reference, because both disintegration and delamination can mean multiple things, right? So we can disagree on the dictionary definition. So I think that a lot of times when we talk about delamination, we talk about the sort of vertical disintegration, sort of hierarchical disintegration of an organization, whereas disintegration can mean multiple things, but like we are meaning sort of that split. Did I just, yeah, this is vertical, this is fine, it's fine. Let me just try to find a visual and someone else can talk for a second.
So one of
So
the
for people that don't have the benefit of a visual, what we imagine and what Sasha's going to put on the screen for anyone who's watching is effectively a idealized org chart. So you have a triangle, there's executives at the top, managers in the middle, and practitioners on the bottom. And we call delamination the separation, the disconnect between the layers. So if you have some strategy that the executives think the company should have, but the practitioners don't understand what that strategy is or how their work is contributing to it, then you've got some delamination. And that can be a combination of information or incentives that's creating the delamination between those different layers. And we use the word lamination because it relates to layers. And then the disintegration we talk about is these disconnects and misalignments between different capabilities, or sort of this departmental disconnect as you go from, the classic dev to ops would be a disintegration.
Yep. And, one of the things that I try to convince people of sometimes is when it comes to the disintegration piece and the misunderstanding between different parts of the organization, is this idea that's that I call presumed rationality. In presumed rationality, you invert who's dumb in essence, right? So instead of saying they're dumb, you go, wait a second, I assume that they're acting rationally. They have a reason for doing what it's doing. So if I don't understand what they're doing, it's something that I'm missing. It's not something that they're doing wrong necessarily. It's something that I don't understand about why it's rational for them to behave in the way that they're behaving. So it's actually my responsibility to try to figure out what it is they're doing, right? And so, there's all sorts of different kind of techniques.
It sounds like you're giving me a new job, though.
Yeah, but it's just the classic, like going to the Gemba, except instead of going up and down, it's going left and right, right? So the idea here is to say, hey, they might be wrong. They
but
may
James,
not.
That's not my job.
Well, how are you supposed to, in a situation where you have organizations that are attempting to create flow across the organization, across the different parts of the system that are supposed to be integrated into a stream, if you can't actually understand how is the work that I'm producing consumed by the next group? That's the integration point, right? The work I produce is consumed by someone else. If I don't understand how they're using it, it's just like, it'd be like saying in a product company, oh, it's not my responsibility to understand how my customers use my product. That's their problem. I sold it to them. It's they should figure it out now. But that's not how product companies work, right? Like product companies.
Oh, I don't know. That seems like how a lot of product companies work. I'm kind of being devil's advocate here, but the point that I think we're both trying to get to is if you're trying to optimize the whole,
Yep.
then everyone making the local optimization, and this is right back to Deming and a bunch of these other
Yep.
thinkers, is not going to it's not going to optimize the whole.
That's correct. So you have to understand how to make your local rationality work within a globally rational system, right? And another thing I'll really quickly point out is when we say global rationality, we don't mean like rational on Earth. We mean rational within the organization.
Planetary, intergalactic rationality.
Yes, exactly. Universal. Maybe we'll have a third term, universal rationality, where it would make sense in any time and any space. That's not really what we mean.
Yeah, whenever you're modeling, you're always going to be making something about the boundary conditions that are going to close this system. But
yeah.
So if we presume that these kind of fractures, these disconnects occur, how can we detect them, and then how can we address them?
So like if we start with like delaminating, right? Like part of delamination in my model of what I mean by delamination is basically you look at these three different layers and you say the layers are not just localized in the organization. Like there's practitioners and managers and executives like that. Those are kind of like locations or groups within the organization. They're actually also temporally localized. In other words, the people who are practitioners tend to live within a time span of like, in most organizations these days, like a 2 or 3 week sprint cycle or whatever you're going to describe. Like they deliver stuff quite quickly. They have a proposition and then they complete that proposition within a reasonable period of time.
It's a task-based cadence usually.
That's right. And then so you can move up, right? And you get into kind of management. Now these people in general are going to say, I'm going to make commitments on behalf of the organization that are going to be like 6 months to 12 months, right? So like I'm going to try to convince the executives to invest in some sort of program.
Usually a combination of quarterly and annual planning.
That's right. So, you can think of the people who live in this part of the organization are not just managers, like people managers, but they're like architects and product owners and things like this. And their job is to try to convince the executives like, hey, I've built a thing like this before, or we've looked at other people who've built things like this before. So this is what we need to do for the next 6 to 12 months. And of course, there's a slightly higher amount of risk saying to the organization, we need to commit to doing this for 12 months than it is to say we need to commit to doing this for 2 weeks. So there's a different level of kind of rigor or justification that's required at that level, right? And you go up to the top level and now you're talking to executives and things like that. And who are they trying to justify themselves to? They're trying to justify themselves to the board, to the bank, or a bank to get money, or the market, right? And so those people tend to ask longer term questions, right? Like, okay, so if I'm going to give you a loan, what are you going to do with it for the next 2 to 3 years? If I'm a board member, what's the direction you want the company to go in over the next 5 years, right? So these are longer time spans. It's not 100% true, right? Like executives make short-term commitments sometimes, but in general, you can think about that. Now, there's just one more piece to it that I think causes the delamination effect. And this is that because there's different time spans, people end up talking about different things and thinking about those different things in different ways. So to imagine this really quickly, most organizations, if you ask somebody, hey, what are you doing? You'll get between like 10 and 15 minutes to explain what you're doing, right? So if you are in a sprint or a scrum team, or you're, some sort of practitioner, you're going to explain what you're doing for the next 2 weeks for the next 15 minutes to me, right? So you're going to have the things you're going to talk about are going to be quite detailed, and the methods that you're thinking about, those things are going to be very like, cause and effect, tight cycle related questions and answers. If you go up a level into the middle, now you're going to have to tell stories that last for 6 to 12 months. You can't be as detailed as the small team can be. You run out of time, right? So, and then you go up another level and you have to tell a 5-year story in 15 minutes. So the subject matter, the things that are talked about, the epistemologies, the way we think about it and justify it change as they go up to different levels. And so this means that you're in an organization where in essence, we're all pointing at the same elephant. We're all talking about the same thing, but we're talking at different levels of granularity, both temporally and kind of task-based wise, right? Thinking wise. And so the result of that is that if you aren't careful, the practitioners can produce a lot of information very, very quickly because they're spinning their cycles very quickly, and they have like direct cause and effect relationships that then, if they're not like integrated up the levels, then you get this problem where like the people at the edge seem to know what's happening really, and the people at the top seem to be talking about fantasies and stories that are no longer aligned. And then you get this delamination, right? You get this shift where one part of the organization is telling a story that no longer fits with the upper level of the organization anymore, right? And this gets worse the bigger the gaps are between the different parts of the organization. And so I think in order to kind of figure that out, one thing is that you have to try to keep people thinking in their own time span. In other words, to understand the types of stories they're trying to tell and the type of subjects they're trying to address. And then you need to link them across the three time spans so they kind of stick together constantly. And this is,
I agree with everything you're talking about in the language we're using around the differences in we'll call it temporal locality, where you have different time spans, and then the access to the details of the information. But I'll add that there's also in many organizations a incentive to not just filter the information as it goes up, but to qualitatively change the information, right? And so you get this watermelon reporting, which the kind of bottom level thinks everything is red, and then by the time it gets through the managers to the executives, everyone thinks it's green. And you even if you did have the right information, you can make different decisions, but you kind of have the wrong information, so you're steering the ship or whatever your metaphor is with that bad information.
I think that's right. Yeah. And so like I usually describe the relationship. So the bottom up relationship, right? The practitioners to the executives is the executives being surprised. Like, why are you doing that? What's happening? Like, what are you doing? And then the top down relationship is confusion. Why are you saying that? Why do you think that's the direction we should be going in? Like, what's happening? So there's that's the kind of like emotive way you can tell that you're delaminating. You got confusion about why the executives are asking you to do these things, and you got surprise that the practitioners are doing certain things by the executives. This is like a prime moment of noticing, hey, wait a second, like things are not, stuck together anymore. The narratives are skewing across each other and they're not lining up anymore. And that's a moment to really be reflective and try to figure out how to stitch things back together again. So that's I'll stop there for a second, but those are some of my kind of thinking about those different layers.
So you gave us and I think is a useful thing, the surprise and confusion, to indicate it.
Yep.
What can be done if you observe that you think there's some delamination?
Yep.
What can be done for addressing the delamination?
Yeah. So sometimes when I talk about, I swear I'm going to come back to delamination really quickly, but it makes it a little easier to understand it with the disintegration piece first. So sometimes when you talk about like going from dev to ops, or a perfect example of this is like a platform team and a product team, right? And they start talking to each other about wanting something, right? And one of the things that happens is that the platform team tries to use authority to enforce the platform on the product team. And the kind of response to that is the product team, which is closer to the market and has kind of more power in the organization, usually like we are actually the people who are providing something to the customer, push back and say, no, we're not doing that. You need to just provide me with the servers and go away, right? So this is kind of a disintegration moment. And one of the things I try to tell platform teams all the time is you need to explain the value of the platform to the development teams in terms that they actually care about. You can't tell them your terms, like why it's valuable for the organization globally to just want the platform. You actually have to say the global goal is this, and this is how you using the platform will benefit you and the global organization, right? So it's a way of saying that there's two sides to some conversation, and one side needs to explain itself in the terms of the other side.
You have to negotiate in terms of their selfish interests.
That's right. You have to understand what do they want and why are they doing what they're doing. You have to kind of, again, that presumed rationality theory, right? I think the same thing happens up and down. And what I mean by that is when you go from like up the stack and you start telling different stories about different ways of thinking and different things are important to the topic, it becomes critical, for instance, that architects and platform engineers and product owners be able to explain what they're doing in terms that make sense to the executive. Not just like, you told me to do this, so I did that, but this is why we're doing this thing. And you tend to think in these longer term models. So this is the financial implication. These are the commitments that we need to make. Those are ways to start stitching the stories back together. So you want to be able to, in order to reintegrate the layers, in order to relaminate the layers, you need to explain yourself up in a way that makes sense up. And of course, the inverse is true, right? Like the executive needs to be able to explain, listen, this is what we want to do for the next 5 years. This is what I think we need to do for the next 6 to 12 months. You know a little bit more about that than I do because you spend all of your time in that temporal locality. So I need you to respond back to me and tell me what I'm missing because I don't have all the details that you have. And then that comes down again another layer where the architects and the product owners, for instance, are telling the teams, this is what we're doing in the next 6 to 12 months. This is what I think we should do for the next 2 to 3 sprints. And the sprint teams have to come back up and say, hey, listen, you're generally in the right direction, but we need to do these 2 or 3 things in order to even be prepared to do the longer term stuff you're talking about. So the integration is, in strategic terms, reestablished by something that's called back briefing, but it's back briefing across these kind of temporal layers and these different, I'll use my fancy philosophy terms, ontologies and epistemologies, things that we're talking about and ways of thinking about it. So that's the integration. And in the same way that like in DevOps, we talk about the idea that developers shouldn't become operators and operators don't have to become developers. We're not trying to create a monoculture, or we're not trying to like completely make everyone a full stack engineer. The same thing's true here. We need people to be responsible for each of the temporal layers. They need to stay in their temporal space. There's temporal lane, but they need to be constantly kind of reintegrating their view of the world, their temporal space with the one that's like located just below it.
So this might be leading the witness, but I kind of think everything in terms of these kind of contracts and promises, API like engineering model, and every part of the organization has the opportunity to negotiate their contracts for their inputs and their outputs, and should be doing that with some understanding, as much as they're allowed in their context, of this globally rational outcome that you're trying to drive. And the other thing I want to point out, which was kind of implied from some of the stuff you're saying earlier, is there's a different power dynamic. Sometimes as you go across, but definitely as you go down. Mm-hmm. And then you also have these levels of responsibility and levels of, so it's not just the time scales are different, but the choices that are made at the top have cascading impact, down and across that the practitioners maybe don't have, right? So you got to be thoughtful about how some of those contracts get negotiated, because that's also a time scale problem.
I think that's right. And I think that the drifting problem, I think, is a little bit of what I was describing, and it's related to what you're saying. So what I mean by the drifting problem is, again, people on the edge tend to get information faster, so they notice that the system's skewing off of the narrative, the storyline that is going faster. They're touching things and producing information at a much more rapid pace, right? And so the delamination can be caused simply by that layer shifting its view of the world faster than the other layers can keep in pace with it, right? That makes sense. And so
layer pacing problems.
That's right. You get a pace layer problem. And so one of the things about having these tic tacs between the different layers is the closer you can tic tac, the more resolution you have, the faster you can notice the shifts, the way that the layers are skewing against each other, right? And then you can
the language I like to drag software back to it is continuous integration of
100%.
your worldview.
Of the different worldviews. That's exactly right. And so I think when you do that well, you'll start realizing that as you go higher up in the organization, one of the things you want to recognize is you cannot keep the layers completely aligned at all times. It's not like actually a possibility. And so what you need to do is make sure that the control that you're placing down into the organization has enough wiggle room in it that it doesn't cause the system to become brittle, because the upper part of the organization has been overly specific about what the specific things that need to be done are, because that will cause the organization to hit walls faster and not have enough time to renegotiate their contracts internally. Does that make sense?
So, like, as usual, I like to be practical, right? So like everybody has these problems to some extent, right? And everybody's busy and everybody has their own like work plate full at every level of the organization. And like, how do we make it easy for people to do the right thing?
Right.
This is the $1 trillion question, right? And it's also contextual. So I think there's some things to say here, but I want to point something out, that when you talk about delamination and disintegration, and we've sort of illustrated this very clean model of, everything's separated between these layers, or everything's disintegrated between the departments. But in reality, you have this problem or opportunity that different parts of the organization have more affinity, or different departments might have a stronger connection between the executives and managers and the practitioners, right? So you really have this fabric of different levels of connection between I don't know why these people are calling me, but I will try to deal with that in a minute. The point I want to get to is it's not always as clean, and that what you're trying to get to, and what I try to help people think about, is what are the deliberate meetings and metrics that we need to keep these worldviews as laminated and integrated as we possibly can.
Yep. And I think like that, I think there's like an organic kind of model that you can think about, and we can try to move away from a more mechanistic, fully aligned model, and more talk about having a coherent model that's cohesive. In other words, it's stuck together, but it's like, the joints in your body are not mechanisms. They're not like, bolts and tinker toys, right? They're like stuck together with organic material that allows them to move in certain ways, right? And so what we're trying to do is like keep the organization stuck together with some sort of like elasticity between the layers that allow them to wiggle a little bit. And then we're just trying to notice when the edges of the stretchiness are going to cause it to rip apart, like, again, like start to delaminate, start to peel, right? And so I think the metaphor between the layers, both up and down and left and right, is about keeping things stuck together, keeping things coherent. And so in like in epistemology, in the way we think about the world and in those things, coherence is like a measure of truthiness, right? Like it's a measure that like that makes sense. It may not absolutely be true, but it's like enough that I can kind of work with it, right? I can understand what's happening on the other side. And in some kind of organizational design work, this is an idea that's called either common ground or interpredictability between layers. And so interpredictability is not that like I look at what Sasha's doing over there and I go, I would do what Sasha's doing. Sasha's doing the right thing. What it means is there's a subtle difference between looking at Sasha and being like, that's what she's doing is completely irrational. It does not make any sense to me at all. And saying, that's not maybe how I would do that, but I understand why Sasha's doing it that way. That's interpredictability. It's that I can predict the things that Sasha's going to do. And I don't have to agree or disagree with it. I just have to like look at it and be like, okay, that's not completely insane what she's doing. It's not completely irrational. And so I think that's the level. So like, again, we were talking about like the kind of having like glue or organic interactions between the different layers. That's caused by not trying to over specify. I'm not trying to tell Sasha what to do because it makes sense to me. I'm just trying to look at Sasha and be like, we've had enough conversations now between us that I can look at what she's doing and say, okay, so this is the overall goal of the organization. Sasha says she's doing it that way. That makes sense. It may not be the way I would do it, but I understand what she's doing. Therefore, I can actually make predictions about what I'm going to do that will generally align with what she's trying to do, as opposed to like, she's so irrational that I can't understand what I'm doing. So I'm going to just exclude all of her outputs and thinking from my decisions about how I'm going to do things because I can't make sense of why she's doing it, right? So now I've not just made localized decisions, I've made localized decisions because I can't take in input from the rest of the organization at all. And if
I think this is like evident in both types of fractures, right? So like this lack of coherence, like especially like if you're a line worker and you're looking up and you're like, why would my executive say the strategy was X, Y, and Z, where like I actually know that on the ground here I don't have this capability, or our competitors are much better at this, or whatever, right? Yep. But also kind of between departments sometimes, right? But like, you know, why are devs pushing updates on us versus why are ops so bad at maintaining 100% uptime, whatever. Yep. But it, like, I think the, you know, just thinking about it, it works in all directions, but like probably one of the interesting ones is like people down the bottom looking at the executives and being like, absolutely. I do not understand where we're going and why we're going there.
Yep. And so I think like one of the things, and you know, this is another kind of easy kind of practical measure of coherence, right? That's related to what you're saying, Sasha. There's like a difference between having a good strategy and just deploying that strategy well. In other words, you can have a great strategy, but if no one understands what the strategy is, they can't do it, right? And there's a problem that is caused by executives talking to other executives. They all talk about the same things in the same stories. And so when they say to another executive, like, this is the strategy, the other executive is more likely to go, oh yeah, I tell stories like that about those types of things with that kind of thinking. So what you're saying makes sense. Great. And then the executive goes and tries to explain it to the line staff or the practitioners, and they go, I don't tell those types of stories. I don't think about those types of things. And I don't think about those types of things in that kind of way. They're like, I don't understand what's happening, right? Why are you saying that, basically?
But also in practical, like in so many organizations, like the line worker, quote unquote, just doesn't know how to translate the strategy. Correct. Like, so we're going to win the market with Gen AI. Like, how am I here in my spot going to win the market with Gen AI? Like, did someone disambiguate what actual actions I need to do?
Exactly. I think there'd be a high value to trying to make some of this more concrete and specific. But what you just said is interesting in another way, because I think that right now there's probably a lot of organizations where executives are saying we're going to win the market with Gen AI, and it's not just surprise or I mean, it's not just confusion by the time it gets to the bottom. It's literally an impossible winning condition for that organization to accomplish, right? So it's like you can say whatever you want at the top when you're disconnected from the ground truth of what's happening, and make all these strategies and how you're going to win, but that's not even a game you're playing in many cases.
Yep. And so this is the very practical measure of coherence, right? The very practical measure of coherence is when the executive says something, if the staff looks at it and goes, that's bullshit, is not coherent. If the staff looks at it and goes, it's not bullshit, I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but it doesn't seem like complete bullshit. Like, I can understand Like, I understand how our position in the market would work, and I understand, like, then it's coherent. It's not that someone has laid out a very explicit plan for achieving the result, but they've told the staff, the practitioners, enough that the practitioners can go, "Oh, right, yeah, I can imagine what I would do next. I can imagine, I don't necessarily know we can get there, but I can imagine that these are the things that I would do next." And in general, I think this has a lot to do with the idea that, like, most people in organizations have a long list of things they have to do every day. They've got a lot of stuff that they're basically left to prioritize for themselves, right? They have to figure out how to get their work done. They've got a backlog. They have to figure out what to do next. The more coherent the strategy is, the easier and faster the teams will be able to prioritize their list of things to do. The less coherent and more bullshitty it is, the more likely they won't understand how to prioritize their list because they don't have anything to prioritize it with. And then the entire organization prioritizes against their own local priorities, and the whole thing gets skewed. And then the strategy is not just that, frustrated by each team not necessarily doing the most strategic next thing, but that the organization is literally like sprinting in different directions and getting further apart from each other, doing things that don't necessarily make sense. So the coherence of the strategy has to do with the individual teams being able to say, I understand what tasks in my list of things to do are strategically aligned versus stuff that I just have to do to keep the lights on. And I can understand how to prioritize and make the trade-off between choosing the strategic work and keeping the lights on. I can figure that part out for myself. And so a good strategy is like a list of questions that the teams can answer, as opposed to a list of directions about what they should specifically be doing, right? These are the types of things we're trying to answer. What work do you have right now that could help contribute to answering those questions so that we can validate the strategy, pursue the strategy, and execute on the strategy, right? If you can't get teams to understand those things, then you don't have a coherent strategy, and the teams will just write it off. They'll be like, well, I don't understand what we're doing. I don't understand why we're doing that, but I do have this long list of things, and I can just do random things in there. And at least if someone comes and asks me what I'm doing, I can say I'm doing these things.
I look busy. I at least look busy. I think this is a great concrete example, and you see this in many organizations where the indication to me is when they're like, can you help us prioritize our work?
Yep, absolutely.
And to me, that's because they're not connected to this larger outcome. They don't have coherence with whatever the strategy is. So that means all these priorities are competing, and you are going to have competing priorities. And I'm not saying prioritization is a solved problem, but it's made even harder when you don't connect to the greater outcome, the globally rational outcome.
That's right.
Well, so I mean, strategy is more complicated too, because like there's a couple of things that a lot of people do. One is saying aspirational things, right? So like, again, we're going to win market with Gen AI. Like, that's not a strategy. It's an aspirational idea of like, okay, we're going to use this technology and it's somehow going to make things better. That happens a lot. Like, at least in my career, I've seen that particular thing happen a lot. And then the other thing that's like really, really prevalent is people making a plan instead of a strategy. So like, we're going to build another plant, right? Because it's an action and you can track it and you can understand if you did it or not. Like, you don't know if it's going to help you win or not. Like, you don't necessarily say how it's going to help you win, but like, we're going to hire 100 people, or we're going to lay off 100 people or whatever. Like, that's an action, not a strategy. So.
There's starting to be some good content that's been out for a while about this tension between strategy and planning. And I think that the reason people like planning versus strategy is that they don't want to deal with the inherent uncertainty, right? So it's easy to say we're going to take this action. It's hard for organizations, and it kind of goes back to some of the narrative building that Jay was mentioning that you need to get support, where you have to frame it in terms of the uncertainty. People and it seems that this gets even more prevalent as you go up the organization, want to think, they want to talk in certainties. They'll take predictability over, they'll take predictable mediocrity over uncertain awesome every time.
Absolutely. I think the other, like really quickly, because the other one that's, strategy tends to be thought up down, the delamination problem, but a real kind of like specific example of the disintegration of strategy is this. So like, let's say, in fact, your architects and your product managers do have a coherent strategy. In other words, they understand the strategy, right? But they optimize in their own functional or capability areas, right? So let's say, for instance, you've got an architectural or a technical roadmap, and then you've got a product roadmap. The number of organizations I've gone into and said, have your architects reviewed the product roadmap with their technical roadmap, and have your product owners reviewed the technical roadmap with their product roadmap, and made sure that they're, it's a terrible term, but synergistic, that they're trying to do the same things roughly in the same time periods? Or do you just have this kind of alignment that goes up and down, and then, you've got your operations people and your architects building capabilities that the product owners have no intention of using anytime in the near future? Or the product owners are building things with the expectation that certain technical capabilities will be provided by the platform or by operations that the operations teams are not actually planning to provide. So this is where you get, strategy that's going up and down, but it's not actually integrated across. And so this is a big part of getting strategy deployment to work well in my mind. It's like the number one measure of success of strategy deployment to me is peer-wise communication. And what I mean by that is that teams talk to other teams, architects, product owners, and managers talk to other product owners and managers across the organization. And the executive becomes responsible for making sure that the alignment isn't just driven down, it's driven across the organization. That is the work of strategy to me in order to keep the delamination and disintegration from overwhelming the organization's capabilities.
In my mental model, a lot of this is when people start referring to the frozen middle. Yes. It's that the way that the organization is incentivized, the frozen middle, the middle managers, is that they're just kingdom building, and they get rewarded for whatever appeals to their direct executive, and not for those integrations, right? So you end up with these OKRs or KPIs or whatever the metric of du jour is for your organization, that are not concerning themselves with the outcome for the organization, but only for the output of that particular department.
That's right. Yep. And it's like, again, sometimes I try to say like strategy when you think about, like, I don't know, if you're planning a multi-week hike, or if you're two different army units, right? Part of strategy is I need you to arrive at this particular point within a certain time period, because I'm going to arrive there and you're going to have something that I need when I get there, right? Like, you're going to have the food that I need. You're going to have the ammunition that I need, all that. So part of strategy is about tempo, timing, and synchronizing the exchange.
Logistics.
That's right. And that's what, again, the integration part is not about making sure everyone's marching straight. It's about making sure they're going to arrive at certain points in time with the right things available for each other, right? And plausibly, exactly, right. And that's what I meant.
So that's a thing, right? If you start talking about logistics, and like, you always have to think about plan A, plan B, and plan C. And somehow in IT organizations, we very rarely even get to plan B or at any kind of backup at all.
Yep, that's because we drive towards, like, again, what Andrew was talking about. We keep on driving towards certainty, where certainty results in almost certain failure, as opposed to probability, where probability makes success probable, right? And that means, like, not being over, like, you can't say, I need you to deliver this specific thing on this specific day at noon. That's the most likely failure situation, right? What you need to say is like, within these couple of weeks, we're going to arrive and we need to, figure out how to make that thing happen within that time period. And that becomes a way of thinking through things. And like, again, if you want to use specific methodology, that's like,
it's interesting. Like I'm just thinking of if this is because software appears always more subjective and more fungible. So like you can argue, did I actually deliver the product feature or did I not deliver the product feature?
Right.
Whereas if I showed up and it, like, the ammunition wasn't there, it's objectively not there. And now I have to figure out how to deal with it. Right. Like, and I don't have choices. Like if I don't have a plan B, then I'm screwed. So like, it's interesting. Maybe we just overestimate how good we are at doing software. And that's where we consistently make this mistake.
I think that's part of it.
Schrodinger's feature. Is the feature alive or dead inside?
Is it a feature or a bug?
I think that's part of it, but I think there's another like version of this, which is so like the difference between critical path and critical chain. So critical path is like, what are the steps we need to do to achieve something, right? And multiple teams would like lay out their critical path. These are the things I need to do in order to achieve the outcome, right? And critical chain says something different. Critical chain says, given the resources required, when do they need to be available? It's a completely different question, right? And the result of that is that the resources can be seen as integrated across the teams. In other words, your resource for doing YAML needs to be available during this time period because my resource for doing, Hugo is going to be available at that time. I need to make sure that those resources, those people, those capabilities are available at certain periods of time. And that means that you can't just prioritize your local path. You have to prioritize the availability of the resources to the organization. That's a way of kind of starting to think through the way that things arrive at specific moments, as opposed to thinking of, you do your thing, I'll do my thing, and then we'll just arrive at a specific point in the future, right? And I think that's it's critical. And like in different organizations, it's become more or less critical based on how predictable their workloads are, right? So, for instance, in organizations that have really, really a lot of acquisition and divestiture as their kind of primary strategy, we buy companies, we sell companies, we integrate them, we disintegrate them, right? Those are very bursty and unpredictable, right? And so you need more of these kind of critical chain theories. What resources do we need to have in order to quickly integrate a new organization into our organization is more important than the critical path versions.
Yeah, now you have the problem that you have this full triangle disintegration delamination problem inside of each of these little subcultures that you're trying to integrate.
That's right. So the more predictable the organization, like again, I mean, I hate these type of comparisons if you think about them too much, but organizations that build cars have a much more predictable throughput. They have a much more predictable, these are the number of cars we need to build, and the kind of tolerances around how many cars we can build per hour are relatively well understood.
Widgets are more predictable than thoughts.
That's right.
Than knowledge work.
And then you move over into knowledge work, and it's not, I think a lot of people like to imagine that, the problem with knowledge work is that everybody does something new all the time. I think the problem is that it's harder to predict what you're going to be doing next month. That's the problem. The problem is that the work changes a lot. There's a difference between software and hardware in that hardware is hard. It's intended to be predictable and not change. And software is intentionally soft. It's intended to address less predictable, more malleable, more changing environments. And that's really the nature of why the strategy becomes different, is because it's harder to predict what the team's going to be doing in a month or two from now. Because the information that arrives out of the marketplace and out of the organization shifts a lot more frequently than inside of an organization that's, for instance, building a car.
So this is the kind of stuff that we like working on and talking about. And when Sasha saw these triangles, she said it tickled her brain as a way to kind of connect to some of the gibberish that we've been spouting. But getting to the practicality, as Sasha likes to say, what can people do? Like, what if you think, okay, this makes sense, we probably have some delamination or disintegration, what can they do? And then also the question is relevant to each of these different layers and roles. The game that you can play as an executive is quite different than the game you get to play if you're a practitioner.
Absolutely. I mean, so like I have one of my favorite answers is to work with your role descriptions and always have a section in the role description that says who you're going to do the work with. So for instance, if you're a strategist, you strategize with what other roles? Like who are you responsible for doing strategy with? So that you, and ideally that would cross some of these layers, right? So like you're responsible for doing strategy with a team lead. You're responsible for doing strategy with some executive, right? So that there is inside of the formal structure of the organization expectations about who is going to talk with who about what, how often, right? And this gets us back to the ergometric theory that we have.
This was me like trying to talk on mute, but yeah, I think you kind of both brought it up before, which is like one of the ways to help start addressing these problems is just meet and talk with people. So like strategically choose who you're going to meet with and when and how often, right? And at like if you come in with sort of good intentions, good questions, and good conversation, then it can, a lot of times it can reconcile those like assumptions, like, right? Like, oh, these people over there are just doing this stuff to make our lives harder. It's like, that's not usually true, but they usually do it because either they don't know they're making your life harder, or like they just haven't had a chance to think with you about how things can be different.
Absolutely.
The language I like, which drags us right back to the scary waters of probability, is what hypothesis are we testing together, and what are we measuring to test it?
Yep.
So that conversation should not be just, oh, let's get together. Although there is some benefit to humanizing each other in all these roles and across and up and down. But what are we looking at together where we have this shared common ground? We can make a hypothesis that we're going to test. And if that metric changes this way, or we talk about balancing metrics and systems of metrics, this system that we designed that we're measuring, are we proving our hypothesis or are we disproving our hypothesis? Because we're doing science.
That's right. And so like, I think there's a way of saying like, do we understand our strategic objective? What hypothesis do we have for executing against that subjective strategic objective? What information, what decisions do we need to make about our hypothesis? So, the hypothesis is a little bit like a decision, but like, what do we need to decide? What is the decisions that we need to make about this hypothesis? What information do we need to have in order to make those decisions? Okay, great. What do we need to measure in order to make those decisions? And then what we need to do is meet on a regular basis with the idea that the information is not readily available. It will come over time because we're doing things. So what we need to do is say, these are the types of decisions we need to make in order to validate or invalidate this hypothesis about this strategy. We need to meet on a regular cadence based on how long it will take us to produce the information that allow us to make these decisions. And we need to be measuring those things actively in order to inform the decisions.
But you bring up a good point. Sorry,
I was going to say, like, this is a topic for the next time because it's a longer discussion. But the other thing that's important in the whole mix is empowerment, like who's empowered to take what actions.
Yep.
Because collecting information and having a hypothesis is all well and good. But if you can't address what's happening, then you can still come together and humanize and rant together, but it's not necessarily.
Yeah, if you're not empowered, then that information is almost painful. Right, you get what's possible. I want to make one quick comment, adding to what Jabe said, that, and this is very common when people get excited about something like SRE, is that the data itself is not readily available in a lot of organizations. So there needs to be some deliberate investment in getting the metrics in a way that people can consume them. And my recommendation, and this is something, there's some gaps in the tooling, but trying to get it to where that becomes just the de facto ambient information that everyone sort of has, right? So you're not talking about these point-to-point meetings where you have these two groups that, you know, negotiate that metric, but you have this ambient information that rolls up, and that, you know, if you actually see this in practice in more advanced organizations where, you know, especially in the web ops, big web stuff, there's metrics on the wall. Everyone can kind of see the business metrics, and everyone can kind of see the reliability metrics, and everyone understands that the reliability metrics connect to the business metrics because they see the numbers, they see the correlation. When one moves, it moves the other one.
Absolutely.
And you do get these like cause and effect models that build up over time as you get the metrics exposed, because most of these metrics are hidden. People don't actually understand how to make a good strategy because they don't understand what their levers are for moving themselves in the market. Anyway, with that, is there any parting thoughts before we get back to the rest of the grind?
I'm good.
I think there's a lot of interesting work to do here. This is just like my parting thought is, I think there's patterns that you can talk about with metrics where you could say these metrics, you know, door metrics are example, will help this particular role have these conversations with this particular role, and that could potentially roll up. But a lot of this is emergent and specific to the context. And when I say that, in a lot of the DevOps conversations, platform engineering conversations, there's this presumption about delivering big as a service, and that is such a limited frame for how software needs to be developed and all these other things. So you start to get to manufacturing and these cyber physical systems, and the different departments and the delamination problem get even more pronounced because the time scales now are you know, between the hardware and the software are much more pronounced. So that's where I think there's this interesting emergent thing, is to discover these patterns and these hypotheses that can be supported with the right metrics and the right conversations.
Absolutely.
And with that, we'll get back to it.